She did not lose her household in a fight. She lost it in silence. The servants shifted first, then the rooms themselves, until her title meant less than a single glance exchanged behind her back. No confrontation. No betrayal spoken aloud. Just a home quietly choosing someone else. Tonight, you will watch how a Tudor wife became a stranger in the house that carried her name. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If someone were to step quietly into a Tudor household, they would notice that the place did not feel like an ordinary home. Every corridor seemed to hold its own quiet rules, and every person inside moved with an awareness of rank that shaped even the smallest tasks. The structure resembled a miniature court, built on layers of duty and expectation, where nothing occurred without being placed beneath the weight of hierarchy. The wife held the official position at the center of this order, though much of her authority existed only on parchment and reputation. Her status defined the household, yet it did not guarantee obedience. Servants watched her constantly, not with open challenge, but with the calm detachment of people who saw far more than they were ever meant to speak about. The daily rhythm inside these walls revealed how fragile that official power could be. Meals were prepared and served according to her instructions. But the servants who carried her dishes also carried their own opinions. Their glances as they moved across stone floors could shift the atmosphere of an entire room. The wife's voice might direct the work, yet the execution of each command depended on those who labored under her roof. When she walked down a hallway, she passed individuals who had witnessed arguments behind half-closed doors, whispered disagreements between family members, and private emotions that she tried to hide. They noticed the tension in her posture, the fatigue in her steps, and the way she straightened herself whenever she sensed eyes upon her. A Tudor home was filled with people who understood their tasks, but also understood their leverage. Servants were expected to ignore what they observed, though everyone knew that silence was never free. They saw the household during its most controlled hours and its most vulnerable moments. They tended the fires, cleaned garments, carried letters, and moved through rooms at times when no one imagined they were listening. Their presence was constant, yet their speech was limited to what kept them safe. This mixture of visibility and restraint gave them a vantage point unmatched by anyone else. They knew who argued, who hesitated, who lied, and who pretended not to notice the unraveling of routine. Even the structure of the house reinforced this dynamic. Narrow staircases and intersecting corridors created points where paths crossed without warning. Servants, brushing past each other, exchanged small fragments of knowledge, each detail adding to the quiet network of awareness that threaded through the household. The wife, for all her position, never truly controlled these invisible lines of communication. She could assign tasks, she could impose rules, but she could not restrict what people observed when her back was turned. The household ran on her authority in theory, yet in practice, it ran on the silent labor of those who understood how power moved when no one admitted it was shifting. To those living inside such a structure, this arrangement felt ordinary. A Tudor home always mirrored the world outside, a world where reputation mattered more than truth, and where those at the top depended on those beneath them far more than they dared to acknowledge. The wife's title offered security, but the servant's unnoticed attention offered insight. And insight, in a place where status was always vulnerable, carried its own quiet influence. The wife stood at the visible center, but the servants formed the foundation beneath her, observing every strength and every weakness that passed through the household's daily routines. In such an environment, the balance of authority never stayed still. The household seemed calm on the surface, yet small shifts in behavior, slower footsteps, shorter greetings, altered tones, could signal changes no one dared to mention aloud. The wife sensed these changes without fully understanding their origin. A missed courtesy here, to a delayed task there. Subtle differences that unsettled her more than outright defiance ever could. Servants who once appeared loyal became harder to read, and she felt her position depended on thoughts she could not hear and judgments she could not see. A Tudor household was meant to be stable, yet its stability rested on a foundation of glances, habits, and quiet observations that carried far more weight than anyone admitted. When the day ended, the house did not truly grow silent. Servants continued their work in dim corridors, talking softly among themselves about what they had seen. Their conversations stitched together moments the wife believed were unnoticed. Each detail lived in their memory, and together, those memories formed a private map of the household's shifting order. They knew when a command came from confidence and when it came from fear. They recognized when a boundary weakened. They understood when a household's balance began to tilt, even before the wife herself sensed the danger pressing in around her. Everything within these walls depended on a hierarchy that looked solid but trembled beneath its own routine. Yet, even in its most ordinary hours, the household's silence carried meanings the wife could never fully grasp. And when those quiet meanings gathered strength, the first signs of change appeared where she least expected them. Servants moved through the house with a presence so constant that it almost disappeared into the rhythm of daily life. They stepped into bedrooms at early hours, carrying linens and water, seeing the household before anyone else had arranged their expressions for the day. They passed through narrow hallways where quiet tensions settled into the air long before arguments became visible. In dining rooms, they stood close enough to observe each gesture at the table, the shifting glance between husband and wife, the stiffness that settled in a body trying not to reveal its discomfort. Their proximity placed them in the center of moments that appeared ordinary on the surface, but revealed far more to anyone trained to notice small changes. They learned the true condition of the household, not from words, but from repetition. A skipped greeting one morning, a door shut more quickly the next, or the untouched portion of a meal that suggested a sleepless night. Servants witnessed these fragments without expecting clarity. Yet each piece shaped their understanding of the house far more precisely than the wife realized. When they entered a room, they absorbed the atmosphere immediately. The lingering heat of an argument, the silence that hinted at something concealed, the disorder of objects that contradicted the calm expression worn by the household's mistress. Their work required attention to detail, and attention inevitably revealed truths no one intended to share. The boundaries of privacy inside a Tudor home were loose by necessity. Servants dressed the wife, prepared her spaces, and managed the objects she touched daily. They were present during her most controlled moments and her most vulnerable ones, seeing the fatigue she tried to hide and the rigidity she used to hold herself together. They saw how she adjusted her clothing before entering a room, how long she paused before issuing a command, and the way her breath changed when tension thickened around her. These small signs were recorded silently, becoming part of the mental map servants carried as they moved through their routines. Even the architecture worked in their favor. Corridors overlapped in ways that allowed glimpses into rooms not meant to be observed. Thin walls carried sound across spaces. The shifting of a chair, or the abrupt stillness after a whispered exchange, told more than any direct statement. Servants who pretended not to hear were often the ones who understood the most. They recognized the difference between a frustrated sigh and genuine fear, between a sharp footstep and one taken to avoid notice. Over time, their understanding formed a quiet ledger of the household's private life, kept not out of malice, but out of habit shaped by survival. Their knowledge extended beyond the wife's awareness. They saw how the husband's mood changed, even before he entered a room. They noticed when the mistress of the house struggled to maintain her control, and when she forced herself to stand taller to preserve the order she believed still belonged to her. Servants observed everything because observation was how they protected themselves. A household could shift quickly, and those who failed to sense the change risked their positions, their safety, and sometimes their dignity. They listened without reacting, watched without interrupting, and stored information in silence that appeared far gentler than the reality it concealed. In the end, the servants held a unique kind of truth. They knew more than anyone acknowledged, and they carried this awareness through every corridor, every stairwell, every small task. Their presence made them the first witnesses to the earliest signs of imbalance in the house. They were there before conflict appeared and long after it faded, understanding exactly what had been lost or gained in the quiet spaces between events. Their knowledge lingered in their routines, shaping how they moved, how they hesitated, and how they eventually chose where to place their loyalties when the household began to shift. Everything they witnessed settled into the house like a second layer of memory that no one else could access. Yet beneath their quiet movements, a slow accumulation of insight shaped how the household truly operated. And when that insight gathered enough weight, it became the first tremor of change that others would feel only when it was too late. Loyalty within a Tudor household was never a fixed or noble principle. It shifted quietly beneath the routines of work, shaped less by sentiment and more by the calculations required for survival. Servants lived in a world where stability depended on pleasing the right people, avoiding the wrong missteps, and sensing the slightest change in mood from those above them. Their allegiance was not granted freely. It was negotiated through advantage, fear, and the constant awareness that their position could vanish without warning. Every task they performed, every movement they made through the house, carried the weight of this unspoken truth. A servant's loyalty often aligned with personal benefit, even if that benefit appeared small from the outside. A kinder tone from one mistress, a rare coin slipped quietly into a palm, a shield offered against unjust anger. These gestures changed the balance of attachment more effectively than orders or declarations. Servants measured people not by status, but by reliability. They recognized who noticed their labor, who dismissed it, who punished without reason, and who allowed small mistakes to pass without cruelty. Each memory accumulated, forming a quiet assessment that guided their loyalty more strongly than any formal hierarchy. The fear of losing their position intensified every decision they made. Employment inside a Tudor home was not merely work, it was survival. Servants who lost their place faced hunger, wandering, or dependence on uncertain charity. This fear pressed into their bodies each morning as they rose before the household stirred. It followed them into the kitchens, onto the staircases, and through the long hours that shaped their day. The possibility of dismissal lived in every task, from carrying a tray to tending the fire. One misjudgment, one display of favor toward the wrong person, could end what little security they possessed. Because of this fear, servants learned to anticipate danger long before it arrived. They watched the wife's expression when she inspected their work. They noted the husband's silence as he crossed a room. They sensed when tension gathered between members of the household, understanding that conflict above often meant consequences below. Their loyalty adapted accordingly, bending toward the figure who seemed most capable of protecting their future. Devotion, in this context, was a matter of alignment rather than affection. The wife might assume her status secured their obedience, but servants obeyed only as long as obedience benefited them. They noticed when her authority faltered, when her voice failed to compel the same response it once did. They detected hesitation in her orders or strain in her attempts to maintain composure. Such moments did not go unnoticed. Servants adjusted their posture, their pace, and their smiles according to the power they believed would last. They acted with caution, but the shift was there, small, accumulating, and revealing where their trust was beginning to lean. Protection played an even stronger role. Servants gravitated toward the person who offered safety when the household grew unstable. If the wife defended them from unfair blame, they remembered if she ignored their presence, demanded too much, or punished without care, they remembered that as well. The one who created a sense of shelter, however slight, became the figure around whom their loyalty gathered. And if another person in the house, someone with charm or subtle influence, offered gestures that suggested greater refuge, the weight of allegiance began to drift. This drift happened quietly. No one announced their change of heart, and no one confessed their calculations. It appeared in softer movements, in quicker responses to one figure's requests, in hesitation when another called their name. It surfaced in the routes servants chose through the house, the people they lingered near, the glances exchanged in narrow hallways. These small shifts accumulated into a pattern, shaping how information moved through the household and determining which voice carried the greatest influence over their daily work. In the end, servants served the household, but their loyalty belonged to whoever protected their survival most effectively. Their silent calculations determined the real flow of power inside the home. They responded not to titles but to security, not to marriage vows, but to the opportunities that allowed them to continue their lives without fear. The wife might believe their loyalty was hers by right, but in truth, it remained something fluid, something shaped by every interaction, every oversight, and every unspoken threat resting beneath the surface of the house. Everything they did reflected a balance built on necessity rather than devotion. Yet within that fragile balance, loyalties could tilt with alarming ease. When the shift finally surfaced, it revealed more about the household's future than any command the wife could give. Power inside a Tudor household rarely shifted through open conflict. It moved in smaller ways, almost unnoticed, until the balance tilted far enough that consequences became impossible to ignore. Servants, who appeared to occupy the lowest place in the structure, held a form of influence that took shape quietly in the spaces others overlooked. Their whispers carried weight not because they intended harm, but because the household relied on them to function. A single remark, spoken softly between tasks, could alter the wife's reputation without her ever hearing the words. One observation shared in the kitchen or at the well could ripple outward through the home, reshaping how others understood her strength, her composure, or her control. The vulnerability of the wife rested in the fact that she could not monitor the attention directed toward her. Servants moved behind her, beside her, and around her, watching the subtle changes in her behavior that she tried to keep hidden. They saw the tension in her hands when she adjusted her sleeves. They noticed when her steps slowed with hesitation, or when her jaw tightened ever so slightly under strain. These details, invisible to those who did not look closely, became the foundation for quiet interpretations passed among servants as they continued their work. Their words did not need malice to carry impact. They needed only accuracy, repeated often enough to become a common belief. Once doubt entered the household, even in its smallest form, it spread through mundane interactions. A servant delivering a tray hesitated for just a moment longer when the wife's voice wavered. Another exchanged a glance with a colleague when the wife issued a command that lacked its usual firmness. Such responses appeared insignificant, yet they accumulated until they signaled a broader shift. The wife felt something changing, but could not see where it originated. Her authority felt intact in theory, but the servant's quiet reactions suggested a weakening she could not directly address. Influence leaked away, not through defiance, but through the subtle erosion of confidence among those whose labor sustained the home. The household's structure amplified this effect. Narrow hallways, shared duties, and overlapping tasks allowed servants to exchange impressions without drawing attention. A simple comment about the wife's distracted expression or her sudden silence after entering a room could spread quickly. The more often these moments were mentioned, the more they shaped the servant's collective sense of her stability. With each repetition, the original observation blended into something larger, becoming a truth accepted, not because it was verified, but because it matched what people quietly sensed. What made this shift so powerful was the fact that servants were everywhere. They stood by the doors the wife believed were closed. They crossed rooms just as tension settled between household members. They handled objects that revealed the private state of the home. Wrinkled linens from a sleepless night, untouched meals, and letters left open on tables. Every detail contributed to an understanding of the household far deeper than the wife's awareness of her own surroundings. Her image depended on what servants observed, yet she had no control over how they interpreted or shared their findings. As doubts grew, the servants' behavior began to reflect their changing perception. They still followed her orders, but with less urgency. They addressed her with the same words, but with a subtle shift in tone that suggested distance. Their movements carried a faint reserve, a small but noticeable change that indicated she no longer commanded the effortless respect she once held. The wife felt these changes in the air around her. Shorter nods, slower responses, a softness in footsteps that made her wonder what thoughts accompanied them. Yet she had no means to confront these shifts without exposing her fear, which only would have reinforced the servant's suspicions. In households built on reputation, perception became reality. Once the servants believed the wife's authority was weakening, the household adjusted accordingly. Their loyalty, already fluid, edged away from her without explicit decision. They turned their attention toward those who appeared stronger, steadier, or more capable of shaping the household's future. What began as a simple whisper evolved into a quiet realignment of power, sustained by the servant's shared sense of what the home required to remain stable. The wife remained unaware of the exact moment the balance tipped. She sensed unease but could not trace its source. The servants said nothing openly, yet their silence carried more meaning than words. By the time she realized her influence had diminished, the servants had already chosen where to direct their trust. Everything in the household shifted on the strength of murmurs she never heard. Yet beneath those murmurs lay a new understanding of who held safety and who did not. As loyalties quietly rearranged themselves, the home settled into an order she could no longer command. The shift inside a Tudor household often began not with confrontation, but with gentleness, placed carefully in the right hands. The mistress who stood outside the marriage, unofficial, unacknowledged, yet undeniably present, understood that servants watched everything. She recognized that their perception shaped the atmosphere of the home more effectively than any order spoken by the legal wife. So she approached them not with authority, but with a softness designed to settle into their routines. A quiet question about their fatigue, a small gesture of concern as they carried heavy loads, or a brief pause to acknowledge their presence. These details threaded themselves into the servant's daily experience in ways the wife rarely considered. Servants were accustomed to moving without notice, completing tasks with minimal recognition. When someone looked directly at them, observing their effort rather than simply expecting it, they felt an unusual sense of visibility. The other woman in the household offered this form of attention deliberately. She stepped aside in hallways to let them pass, paused her movement when a servant rushed into a room with supplies, and allowed a brief moment in which the servant understood they had been seen not as a function of labor, but as an individual. These interactions were simple, but they created a contrast that the servants absorbed without realizing its deeper intent. The wife, in her effort to maintain control, often carried herself with a strictness that left little room for warmth. Her commands were efficient, her expectations precise, and her presence formal, even within the privacy of her own chambers. She did what she believed necessary to preserve the dignity of her position, unaware that her seriousness could appear rigid to those who worked under her. The other woman recognized this dynamic and used it to her advantage. Her gestures remained small, never overt enough to suggest manipulation, yet timed perfectly to highlight the difference between the two women. These moments of gentleness wove themselves into the fabric of household life. A servant setting down a tray felt a brief touch of acknowledgement. A maid adjusting the drapery sensed a quiet appreciation in the other woman's expression. The cook, worn from long hours over the fire, received a simple nod that recognized her effort. None of these acts challenged the wife openly. They merely added a new presence to the servant's world, one that seemed easier, lighter, and less demanding. As days continued, the servants found themselves reacting differently around the two women. They stiffened slightly in the wife's company, anticipating correction or scrutiny. Around the other woman, their shoulders softened, their steps felt less tight, and their silence carried a different weight, one made of cautious interest rather than obligation. They did not yet shift their loyalties, but they noticed the emotional distance between the two female figures, and this distance shaped how they interpreted the household's balance. The household was a confined space, and mood changes spread quickly. A servant's expression altered after a small kindness. Another noticed the shift and remembered it. Wordless impressions travelled from room to room, linking together until the servants developed a shared understanding that the other woman offered something the wife did not. The kindness never interrupted their duties, never encouraged disobedience, and never violated the structure of the home. It simply settled into their awareness, subtle enough to seem natural, yet deliberate enough to influence perception. The wife remained unaware of these small transformations. She interpreted the other woman's composure as passivity, believing silence signaled weakness. What she did not see was how silence created space for strategy. The other woman did not need authority to influence the servants. She needed only to provide what they lacked, a sense of being recognized, even briefly, as people rather than extensions of household labor. Once that feeling took root, it began to shift how servants compared the two women. Kindness, especially when placed in an environment built on hierarchy, became a tool sharper than accusation. The servants did not openly favor the other woman, yet their internal landscape shifted in her direction. They carried their observations into their private conversations, into the corners of the house, where they exchanged impressions while continuing their work. A gesture remembered became a gesture retold, and the retelling shaped quiet sympathy that neither woman could hear, but both would eventually feel. The change was not immediate. It unfolded slowly, growing from repeated exposure to small acts that softened the servant's perception of the other woman and hardened their judgment of the wife's severity. What began as calculated politeness grew into a subtle alliance that formed beneath the surface of daily tasks. No declaration was made, no lines were drawn. Yet the household's center of emotional gravity shifted in ways the wife did not anticipate. Every gesture of gentleness settled where strictness had left a space. Yet within that space, the servants quietly reconsidered where safety truly lived. Once those shifting impressions grew firm enough, the household began to lean toward an influence the wife could no longer sense. Private bonds within a Tudor household rarely formed in open rooms or beneath clear light. They emerged instead in the narrow spaces that connected the larger structure, the kitchen, with its constant heat and shifting shadows, the dim corridors where servants passed one another without drawing attention, the corners of stairwells where footsteps softened into near silence. These were the places where the other woman positioned herself with deliberate restraint. She never demanded conversation. She simply allowed small, quiet interactions to unfold in moments when the household seemed to look elsewhere. The kitchen often became the first site of these exchanges. Servants moved in and out quickly, carrying trays, wiping surfaces, and tending the fire. Amid the motion, the other woman appeared occasionally, not with instructions, but with an unhurried presence that suggested she had entered only to catch her breath. A servant, surprised to find her alone. Offered a nod out of habit. She responded with a soft acknowledgement. Nothing intrusive. Simply enough to suggest she had noticed the strain on the servant's face or the fatigue in their shoulders. The interaction lasted seconds, but it laid the groundwork for a new pattern. Corridors provided even more opportunity. Their low light concealed hesitation, allowing brief pauses that could be interpreted as accidental. The other woman passed a servant carrying linens, then slowed, as though reconsidering her direction, allowing a small window in which the servant could sense a willingness to speak. She did not initiate conversation. She created the conditions under which it might occur. And when a servant finally commented on the weather, the early morning workload, or the difficulty of managing new tasks, she responded with a quiet remark that acknowledged their reality without crossing into intimacy. These early exchanges felt natural, almost unavoidable within the confines of the house. Over time, the conversations carried slightly more substance. A servant mentioned a spilled basin or a mistake nearly made. The other woman reacted with a touch of sympathy, easing the fear that such errors always invited reprimand. Another servant quietly mentioned the unpredictability of the wife's moods. The other woman offered no judgment, only a subtle shift of expression that suggested understanding. None of these moments was significant enough to draw suspicion. They blended into the rhythm of daily life, appearing as ordinary fragments of speech shared in passing. What made these conversations effective was their harmless appearance. To anyone observing, nothing improper occurred, yet each exchange left the servant with the sense that the other woman recognized something that others ignored. The difference between a command and a conversation became clear. Servants began to anticipate her presence in the dimmer parts of the house. They adjusted their pace slightly when they saw her approaching, neither eager nor hesitant, but prepared for a brief interaction that seemed to lighten the burden of their day. Once these patterns established themselves, the servants started to share small details of their work, matters too trivial for formal discussion, but meaningful in the quiet economy of household information. A misplaced cloth, a delayed delivery, or a moment when the wife seemed distracted. These details were not secrets in the traditional sense, yet the act of sharing them created an emerging sense of confidence. The other woman listened carefully, filing away each fragment, aware that servants rarely revealed information without expecting something in return, even if the return was no more than a sympathetic expression. The subtlety of these interactions protected both parties. Servants felt they were offering nothing dangerous. The other woman appeared merely attentive, never encouraging gossip, never pressing for more details, but each shared moment strengthened the bond between them, gradually positioning her as someone who understood the undercurrents of the household better than the wife herself. The servants, without intending to shift their loyalty, found themselves turning toward her when they felt uncertain, anxious, or overlooked. In time, these small exchanges formed a network of relationships hidden just beneath the household's formal structure. The wife remained unaware of the quiet alliances forming in the darker corners of the home. She interpreted the servants' occasional glances as fatigue or distraction. Not recognizing them as signals of conversations she could neither predict nor control. She continued her routines with strict precision, believing that order preserved her authority. Meanwhile, the other woman stepped into the spaces untouched by that authority, building a foundation of influence through interactions too fleeting to be considered acts of rebellion. The servants became keepers of small secrets. Though the term overstated the nature of what they shared, these were not betrayals or confessions, but shifting fragments of truth traded quietly in moments where no one else listened. Yet once a servant shared even a minor detail, they became invested in maintaining the connection. A pattern of small disclosures bound them to the other woman, creating a sense of mutual dependency. They felt seen, she gained information. The exchange grew stronger with each repetition. In the household's deeper silence, these connections gathered weight. The other woman no longer appeared isolated. She threaded herself carefully into the servants' routines, becoming a presence they anticipated rather than avoided. This subtle integration shaped how they responded to her, how they interpreted her intentions, and how they compared her to the wife, whose authority felt increasingly distant. Every private exchange settled into the hidden spaces of the home, shaping bonds no one acknowledged openly. Yet those bonds carried the quiet strength of repeated moments shared beyond the wife's view. When those connections deepened into something steadier, the household began to bend toward an influence rooted not in power, but in presence. Doubt inside a Tudor household did not need sharp accusations to take root. It could grow from gentler gestures, placed carefully in the right moments, where the servants already carried quiet questions they had never spoken aloud. The other woman understood this well. She never pointed directly at the wife's flaws, never voiced criticism that might expose her intentions. Instead, she created small openings in conversation, soft pauses, thoughtful expressions, and casual remarks that encouraged servants to examine what they had seen with new eyes. Her influence emerged not through force but through suggestion, shaping the servant's understanding of the wife without appearing to interfere. These exchanges often occurred during the most ordinary tasks. A servant adjusted a curtain, stepped aside to clear a hallway, or paused at the kitchen table to catch a breath after a long morning. The other woman appeared near them, observing their fatigue with a familiarity that felt safe. She did not speak first. She allowed the silence to stretch gently, giving servants the chance to offer their own comments about the day. When they mentioned an unexpected reprimand or a difficult command from the wife, she reacted not with agreement or denial, but with a quiet tilt of her head that implied she had noticed something similar. This subtle acknowledgement invited interpretation. Servants, already sensitive to the wife's tone and manner, began to connect their experiences with the other woman's silent reactions. They remembered when the wife's instructions felt clipped, when her steps carried impatience, or when her expression seemed colder than usual. These memories drifted into the open spaces of conversation, reshaped by the idea that someone else had witnessed the same behavior. The other woman did not confirm their thoughts, yet her silence permitted servants to continue exploring them. At times, she added a soft question. Nothing direct, nothing accusatory. A simple remark, such as wondering whether the wife looked tired or whether the household had felt tense that morning. These questions did not assign blame. They merely encouraged servants to revisit moments they had previously dismissed. Their responses held no clear conclusions, only impressions. But those impressions grew stronger as they were spoken aloud. The servants began to view the wife through a different lens, one shaped by shared reflection rather than explicit critique. The brilliance of this approach lay in its restraint. The other woman never mentioned the wife's strictness outright. She merely highlighted the contrast between the wife's cold demeanor and the warmth she herself extended in private interactions. Servants noticed when the wife passed them without looking, when her commands arrived in a tone that left little room for comfort, or when she maintained a distance that made her appear unapproachable. These behaviors, once accepted as part of the household's order, began to feel sharper in comparison to the other woman's gentle presence. In kitchens and corridors, servants replayed these impressions among themselves. A maid mentioned the wife's sudden irritation at a minor mistake. Another recalled her silence during a moment that seemed to require reassurance. The more they discussed these small incidents, the more they wondered whether the wife's severity hid something unstable beneath the surface. What began as mild curiosity became quiet suspicion, strengthened each time. The other woman reacted to their words with understanding rather than resistance. The household's atmosphere changed accordingly. Servants approached the wife with a growing sense of caution. Unsure whether her commands came from certainty or strain, they watched her movements more closely, observing the tension in her posture, the tightness in her expression, and the abrupt shifts in her routines. Each observation confirmed the doubts already forming in their minds. The wife felt the shift but could not locate its cause. She sensed hesitation where there once had been obedience. She noticed servants withdrawing slightly, leaving her with an unfamiliar distance she could not bridge. Meanwhile, the other woman's influence expanded quietly. Servants began to view her as someone who understood the emotional currents of the household. They trusted her reactions, subtle as they were, because she never demanded their loyalty outright. She offered only presence, calm, attentive, and grounded in a gentleness that made the wife's rigidity feel increasingly isolating. The contrast deepened with time, until servants found themselves interpreting the wife's actions through a framework shaped by the other woman's quiet suggestions. What made this shift so effective was that no direct criticism had ever been spoken. The other woman never challenged the wife's authority. She simply guided the servants toward conclusions they reached themselves. Doubt, once planted, grew in silence, nourished by the servants' own observations and memories. The wife became a figure viewed with scrutiny rather than certainty, her stability questioned by those whose attention she depended on most. And in a household where perception shaped reality, this subtle erosion of confidence carried consequences far greater than open defiance ever could. Every softened question unsettled the servants just enough to reconsider what they believed about the wife. Yet, each reconsidered thought deepened the space between loyalty and doubt. As that space widened in silence, the household's allegiance settled toward a presence the wife could no longer overshadow. Influence inside a Tudor household did not always require words. Sometimes it rested in the smallest fragments of expression. An altered glance, a pause held a moment longer than expected, or a silence that allowed servants to fill the space with their own conclusions. The other woman understood the power of these subtleties. She knew that direct accusations risked exposure, but suggestion could move through the household unnoticed, shaping perception in ways the wife could neither anticipate nor counter. Her approach relied on restraint, allowing servants to believe that the thoughts forming in their minds were entirely their own. A single look, offered at the right time, carried weight far beyond its simplicity. When a servant mentioned the wife's stern tone or her abrupt instructions, the other woman responded, not with words, but with a shift of expression, slight enough to seem accidental, clear enough to imply recognition. A soft tightening around the eyes, or a stillness that replaced her usual calm, became a cue that she shared the servant's unspoken concerns. The servant absorbed that reaction and held on to it, replaying the moment later when considering the wife's behavior. The look did not accuse. It merely opened a quiet path toward interpretation. Silence itself proved even more effective. During brief interactions in dim corridors or the bustle of the kitchen, the other woman allowed moments to linger, unfilled. When a servant hesitated after describing something unsettling about the wife, she did not rush to reassure or contradict. Instead, she let the servants sit in their own uncertainty. That absence of response made the servant believe their observation held meaning. The power of the pause lay in its emptiness. It encouraged servants to attach significance where none had been stated, convincing them that the wife's perceived coldness or rigidity was part of a pattern rather than an isolated event. These gestures moved quietly through the household. Servants repeated them in conversations among themselves, describing how the other woman seemed to understand without speaking, how she reacted with subtle signs that confirmed what they had already begun to suspect. Each retelling amplified the effect, turning small impressions into shared belief. No direct claims were made, yet doubt spread with the ease of something that felt naturally discovered. The wife never realized that these shifts originated in glances she never saw and silences she never heard. Inside the structured environment of a Tudor home, where servants were expected to remain alert to every emotional undercurrent, these suggestions took root quickly. The servants noticed when the wife's attention sharpened in moments of stress, when her dissatisfaction surfaced in the tightening of her jaw, or when her footsteps grew sharper across the floor. They interpreted these ordinary signs through the framework, subtly shaped by the other woman's expressions. What once seemed like the wife's commitment to order now appeared as evidence of deepening severity. The other woman continued her strategy with precision. She never initiated discussions about her wife, but she placed herself in situations where servants might volunteer their impressions. When they offered small complaints or uncertainties, she responded with carefully measured stillness. The absence of contradiction felt like agreement. Though she had said nothing, the servants began to rely on these quiet exchanges as a way to understand the household's shifting emotional landscape. The wife, meanwhile, sensed a faint change in the servants' demeanor, a hesitation in their eyes, a stiffness in their movements, but had no explanation for its cause. As doubt spread, the servants' confidence in the wife eroded gradually. They began to expect harshness before it occurred, interpreting even neutral gestures through the lens of suspicion. Tasks performed under her command felt heavier, as though her presence carried a strain they had not noticed before. Conversely, time spent near the other woman felt lighter, shaped by the memory of her calm reactions and the quiet understanding she seemed to offer. Without realizing it, the servants shifted their emotional alignment away from the wife, building a form of trust rooted not in words but in subtle suggestion. What made this transformation particularly effective was its invisibility. No accusation had been spoken aloud. No servant could point to a moment where the wife's authority had been openly challenged. The doubt lived only in private thoughts, shaped by glances and silences, strengthened by repeated comparison. The wife's confidence deteriorated without an outward cause. She felt her control slipping, but had no event to confront, no statement to refute. The power of suggestion left her unarmed, weakened not by defiance, but by perception. By the time she realized something fundamental had changed, the servants had already adjusted their expectations. They approached her with caution rather than respect, waiting for signs of displeasure as though anticipating it. Their trust had migrated quietly, drawn toward the person who offered subtle acknowledgement rather than rigid instruction. The shift was complete, though no one named it. Every glance she never witnessed carried more influence than any spoken challenge. Yet those quiet moments gathered into a pattern the wife had no means to trace. When that pattern finally shaped the servant's belief, her authority faded in a silence she could not detect. Small rewards carried a weight far greater than their size inside a Tudor household. A coin slipped quietly into a palm, a ribbon offered without ceremony, or a portion of fine fabric passed along under the pretense of generosity. These gestures reshaped loyalties more effectively than authority alone. The other woman understood this dynamic with precision. She recognized that servants rarely received anything beyond their necessities, and that even a modest token could alter the course of their allegiance. Her offerings were never extravagant, for excess drew suspicion. They were subtle, timed carefully, and delivered in ways that made each servant feel singled out rather than manipulated. The earliest gifts appeared informal, almost accidental. A servant helped her draw a curtain, and she gave them a small piece of leftover cloth from her personal belongings. Another brought her warm water on a cold evening, and she pressed a coin into their hand with a fleeting gesture that suggested gratitude rather than strategy. These items were insignificant in material value, yet significant in memory. Servants accepted them with a mixture of surprise and caution, storing them in their pockets or beneath their beds as quiet markers of attention they rarely received. The impact of these tokens deepened because the guilt of accepting them mingled with relief. Servants understood the precariousness of their position. They knew that favors from anyone in the household carried potential consequences, yet the gifts felt safe, small enough to escape notice, personal enough to feel meaningful. They reassured servants that someone saw their effort, someone recognized their exhaustion, and someone believed they deserved more than silent labor. In a world where acknowledgement rarely appeared, These tokens filled an emotional void without drawing open conflict. Promises strengthened the effect even further. The other woman never promised openly. Yet she let implications settle into the conversation with deliberate lightness. When a servant looked discouraged after a harsh command from the wife, she murmured that the household might soon run more smoothly. When another servant fretted about losing their position, she suggested that loyal workers always found favor with those who appreciated them. These statements did not guarantee anything, but they pointed toward a possible future in which the servant held a more secure place, one shaped by their association with her rather than by fear of the wife's strictness. Servants held on to these suggestions with an intensity the other woman fully understood. Hope was rare in their world. Advancement came slowly, often not at all, and the threat of dismissal lingered constantly. Even the faintest hint of a better position carried tremendous weight. Servants replayed her words in their minds while performing their duties, imagining what it might feel like to work under someone who noticed their effort and rewarded it. In this anticipation, their loyalties shifted long before any actual change occurred. Favoritism also emerged in subtler forms. The other woman paid attention to the smallest struggles: an overfilled tray, a torn sleeve, a servant breathing heavily as they hurried across the room. She stepped aside to ease their burden or allowed them a moment to rest. Gestures tiny enough to seem meaningful, but not excessive. These acts, combined with the earlier gifts, created a sense of protection. Servants began to associate her presence with relief rather than anxiety. They felt less exposed, less vulnerable, and less at risk of sudden reprimand. In a household defined by hierarchy, this emotional shelter held extraordinary power. Meanwhile, the wife maintained her rigid posture, controlling the household with efficiency but little warmth. The contrast sharpened with each passing day. Servants compared the wife's strictness to the other woman's careful generosity, measuring which presence offered them greater stability. The wife's commands felt heavier as the servant's allegiance drifted, while the other woman's subtle kindness grew more influential. What she offered cost her very little, yet it altered the servant's perception of the home far more than the wife realized. The most profound change occurred when servants began seeking her out during quiet moments. They approached her not for instruction but for reassurance, sharing small concerns they would never bring to their wives. She listened with calm attention, allowing them to believe she valued their well-being. In truth, she valued something else: their loyalty, their information, and the gradual power shift that their trust made possible. Each time a servant confided in her, they bound themselves more tightly to the sense of safety she projected. By the time the wife sensed something was wrong, the pattern had already solidified. Servants hesitated before responding to her, remembering the other woman's earlier offers of protection. They carried out their tasks with a faint but noticeable reserve, as though their thoughts were occupied by another allegiance. The wife could not identify the cause, for the gifts were hidden and the promises spoken too gently to leave a trace. Yet the consequences surrounded her, a household slowly slipping out of her grasp. Every discreet token reshaped the servant's sense of who truly valued their labor. Yet beneath those tokens lived the promise of refuge they could not ignore. As that quiet longing for safety grew stronger, their loyalty drifted toward the hand that had offered even the smallest reward. The story of a Tudor household could be rewritten without ever touching ink or parchment. It changed through repeated observations, through the shifting tone of quiet conversations, and through the silent power of interpretation. The other woman understood that perception mattered as much as truth. She recognized that servants shaped the narrative of the home simply by describing what they believed they saw. So she guided their interpretations not by inventing new events, but by reframing those already familiar. Her influence gradually worked its way through the household, altering meaning without altering fact. This process began with the wife's ordinary actions, small moments that once passed unnoticed but now carried new weight. When the wife insisted on order during a chaotic morning, servants remembered the firmness of her voice. They repeated it to one another with a different inflection, one that emphasized severity instead of structure. When she corrected a mistake in the arrangement of linens, the retelling made her tone sound sharper, her patience thinner. These shifts were subtle enough to seem natural. Servants rarely lied. They simply recast the wife's intentions through the lens of their changing perception, a perception shaped carefully by the other woman's earlier influence. The wife's seriousness, once interpreted as responsibility, slowly transformed into something harsher. Servants began to associate her discipline with dominance rather than guidance. A command delivered quickly became evidence of impatience. A request repeated twice turned into proof of irritability. The difference lay not in her actions, but in the way servants chose to interpret them. Their private suspicions, encouraged by the other woman's earlier hints and silences, blended with their daily observations. What they once accepted without thought now felt like part of a larger pattern they had only recently begun to recognize. Even the wife's silence gained new meaning. Servants had long viewed her quietness as the natural dignity of someone responsible for maintaining order. But as doubt settled into the household, her silence began to feel cold. When she entered a room without speaking, servants imagined disapproval. When she observed their work without comment, they sensed judgment rather than concentration. Her stillness, previously respected, now appeared forbidding, and each reinterpretation spread quietly, whispered between shifts of labor, or exchanged through glances in shadowed corridors. The other woman contributed to this shift without ever stating an opinion. She responded to the servants' retellings with small gestures that implied recognition, allowing them to continue shaping the narrative themselves. Her restraint made the new story more believable. No one felt pressured to adopt a particular view. They simply followed the logic of their own impressions, supported by the emotional contrast she provided through her earlier kindness and attention. The wife's behavior had not changed, yet the servants experienced it differently, carrying the revised meaning into every new day. Over time, the narrative took on a life of its own. Servants expected sternness before it appeared and prepared themselves for criticism, even when none was intended. These expectations altered how they behaved around the wife. Their movements stiffened, their breathing tightened, and their attempts to perform flawlessly came from fear rather than respect. The wife sensed this shift without understanding its origin. She noticed their unease, interpreted it as incompetence or inattentiveness, and responded with increased vigilance. Each corrective gesture further confirmed the interpretations that had already taken root. Meanwhile, the other woman's presence offered the opposite experience. Her gentler reactions, her quiet attention, and her careful listening became the servant's emotional counterweight to the wife's perceived severity. They compared each interaction instinctively, noticing how one woman eased their tension while the other heightened it. This comparison did not require explanation or instruction. It grew naturally from their daily experience, shaping their loyalty long before they consciously acknowledged it. Soon, the household operated under a new, unspoken understanding. The wife remained at the head of the home, issuing commands and maintaining structure. But her authority felt increasingly brittle. Servants obeyed, yet their thoughts drifted elsewhere, occupied by interpretations that continued to darken her actions. The other woman stayed quiet, allowing the narrative to unfold around her. She did not need to push. The servants carried the story forward on their own, giving her influence a depth she never openly claimed. By the time the wife realized the story of her character had been rewritten, it had spread too widely to contain. She felt the shift in every shortened greeting and every careful step the servants took in her presence. Her discipline now appeared as cruelty, her calmness as detachment, her silence as coldness. She struggled to adjust her behavior, but the new narrative resisted correction. Once a story took hold within a household, especially one reinforced daily by shared interpretation, it could not simply be undone. Every retold moment reshaped her image more forcefully than any single act she performed. Yet each altered interpretation built another layer of distance she could not close. Once the servants carried this revised story in their daily movements, the wife found herself surrounded by a household that no longer aligned with her intentions. Separating the servants from the wife did not require open instruction. It began with shifts so small they blended into the daily rhythm of the household. The other woman recognized that influence flowed through proximity, and that proximity could be redirected without anyone noticing the moment it changed. Servants who once moved freely around the wife found themselves drifting into different corners of the home, their routines altered by subtle adjustments. These changes reduced the instances in which the wife could claim their attention, leaving her increasingly isolated within the very house she controlled. Reassignments appeared gradual and reasonable. A servant who had previously assisted the wife in dressing was now asked to help with storing fabric in a distant hallway. Another who managed the wife's chamber was instructed to focus on the kitchen stores for a period, a task that took them downstairs for long stretches. These reassignments were justified by the season, by shortages, by the need for efficiency. None of them seemed designed to create distance, yet the effect accumulated steadily. The wife became surrounded by fewer familiar faces, and each interaction required more effort to maintain the connection she once commanded with ease. The servants accepted these shifts because they seemed temporary. They believed the household was adjusting to practical concerns. But the other woman understood that repetition transformed temporary arrangements into normal patterns. The longer a servant spent away from the wife's presence, the more their loyalty faded into habit rather than attachment. Their memories of her softened, then cooled. Their understanding of her became shaped not by direct experience, but by the retold impressions circulating quietly through the household. Communication formed the next layer of distance. Messages that once passed directly from the wife to the servants began travelling through intermediaries. The steward conveyed her requests. The housekeeper clarified her expectations. Each layer dulled her impact, making her voice feel distant even when her instructions remained precise. Servants no longer heard her tone, saw her expression, or observed her intentions. They interacted with a filtered version of her authority. The other woman allowed these layers to form naturally, stepping in only when necessary to reinforce the pattern. In this new structure, the wife's authority remained intact in principle, but weakened in practice. Servants completed their tasks, but their understanding of her motives became increasingly abstract. Without daily proximity, the moments that once humanized her disappeared. Her seriousness seemed sharper because it was rarely balanced by instances of gentleness or clarity. Her silence felt heavier because the servants no longer remembered the context in which it usually occurred. Distance reshaped meaning without requiring a single unkind word. Meanwhile, the other woman positioned herself within sight of the servants at regular intervals. She did not interfere with their duties. She simply allowed them to observe her presence, her calm movements, and her gentle attention to the rhythms of the home. By remaining visible, she encouraged familiarity. Servants began to associate her with their daily work more naturally than with the wife, whose absence grew more noticeable. This slow realignment altered the emotional geography of the household. The wife sensed the shift first through small inconveniences. A servant did not appear when she expected assistance. Another forgot to bring an item she had requested. These lapses accumulated, each one eroding her patience. She felt the need to ask twice, sometimes 3 times, before receiving a response. The distance frustrated her, and her frustration appeared as sharpness that the servants interpreted as severity. The cycle reinforced itself, the less they saw of her, the more intimidating she seemed when they finally stood in her presence. The other woman did not need to encourage these impressions. She allowed the house itself to shape them. Corridors, doorways, and schedules controlled the flow of human contact. If a servant passed through a particular hallway at a certain time, proximity favored the other woman. If their duties kept them in the kitchens during the wife's quiet hours, they encountered only those who already viewed the wife with caution. This design relied on the structure of the home rather than explicit manipulation, making the shift appear natural and unavoidable. Over time, the servants adjusted their posture around the wife. They stood more rigidly, spoke less freely, and completed their tasks with the nervous precision of those who feared making a misstep. The wife tried to soften her presence, but the distance had already taken root. Servants no longer registered her intentions. They registered only what they expected to see. Her attempts at calmness seemed cold. Her measured tone felt detached. The story that had begun as whispers became the lens through which every interaction was interpreted. By contrast, the other woman never demanded anything from them directly. She observed without insisting, creating a sense of ease that they associated with fairness. Her influence did not rely on authority. It relied on presence. Servants gravitated toward the space where they felt least scrutinized. In doing so, they carried the household's emotional center with them, leaving the wife at the periphery of her own domain. Every redirected task created its own quiet shift, thinning the wife's presence long before she noticed it happening. Yet, each new layer of distance made the servants lean toward the voice they encountered more often. When the household settled into this altered rhythm, the wife stood surrounded by faces that no longer reflected her influence. A shift in perception inside a Tudor household never announced itself. It appeared in the smallest gestures, the faintest pauses, and the quiet adjustments that servants made without speaking. The change began in their eyes, an alteration subtle enough to escape immediate notice, yet steady enough to redefine the emotional weight of every room the wife entered. What had once been simple respect turned into something more careful, cautious, almost measured. The servants did not intend hostility. They simply moved through the house with a new awareness that shaped how they looked at her, how they greeted her, and how they carried themselves in her presence. The first signs showed in their posture. Servants who once approached the wife with calm confidence now approached with hesitation. Their steps slowed before crossing her path. Their shoulders stiffened. Their breathing grew quieter. They carried themselves as though preparing for an interaction that might unsettle them, even when nothing in the wife's expression suggested tension. The distance, created earlier, through adjusted duties, redirected proximity, and layered communication, had begun to reflect in their bodies. They no longer behaved like people comfortable within a familiar hierarchy. They moved like people navigating uncertain terrain. Their greetings changed next. The polite phrases they once offered without thought became shorter, almost clipped. A bow lacked warmth. A curtsy felt restrained. Their eyes met hers only briefly, before shifting downward or away. They did not intend disrespect. Yet the absence of ease conveyed something deeper than words could. Their caution made the wife appear more distant than she truly was, and their restraint created a silence heavier than any reprimand she could have given. Each shortened interaction added another thread to the widening separation between them. As this atmosphere settled across the household, servants began anticipating discomfort even before it arose. Whenever the wife entered a room, they straightened abruptly, as if caught in the middle of something they wished to hide. Their tension did not come from guilt, but from the uncertainty that had grown around her. They no longer interpreted her silence as neutrality. Instead, they assumed it meant disapproval. They no longer saw her discipline as fairness. They imagined it as impatience. These interpretations lived only in their thoughts, yet shaped how they behaved until the air around the wife thickened with unspoken restraint. The wife sensed the shift without understanding its source. She noticed the shortened greetings, the cautious glances, the stiff movements. She felt the distance before she knew how to interpret it. In her attempts to correct the mood, she spoke more gently, but her softness was misread as cold. She moved more slowly, but her deliberateness felt like judgment. The servants, conditioned by the new narrative forming quietly among them, filtered her every gesture through the same lens of caution. Her efforts to regain familiarity only deepened the discomfort that had already taken hold. Meanwhile, the other woman did nothing visible to influence these moments. She remained in the background, allowing the household's altered rhythm to develop naturally. She understood that perception, once reshaped, did not require reinforcement. It sustained itself through repetition. Servants compared their interactions instinctively, feeling relief around her and tension around the wife. Without conscious intent, they assigned emotional value to each presence. One eased their day, the other tightened it. This emotional contrast settled into the daily life of the home, shaping their behavior more firmly than any command. Over time, even neutral moments acquired new meaning. If the wife paused before giving an instruction, servants interpreted the pause as disappointment. If she corrected a task, they recalled earlier criticisms more vividly than earlier praise. If she passed them in silence, they sensed judgment rather than concentration. Their internal narratives grew stronger than the actions themselves, guiding their reactions until the household operated under a new understanding of her character, one she had not chosen and could not easily change. The air inside the home changed with these adjustments. Conversations among servants quieted when she approached. Tasks were completed with heightened precision but reduced warmth. The household felt organized but not harmonious. Order remained, but comfort vanished. The shift did not rely on confrontation. It unfolded through everyday motions, repeated until they became the norm. No servant spoke against the wife. No rule was broken. Yet the tone of the home had altered so completely that she felt the difference in every room she entered. Her isolation grew not through defiance, but through caution, an emotion far more difficult to counter. Caution created distance without accusation. It eroded the connection without conflict. It changed loyalty without forcing a declaration. The servants did not intend harm. They simply sought stability, aligning themselves emotionally with the presence that offered them the most ease. Their quiet adjustments formed the foundation of a silent realignment of influence. By the time the wife recognized the depth of the change, the servants no longer looked at her as they once had. Their respect had not vanished, but it had cooled. Their attention had not faded, but it had sharpened into something watchful. Their loyalty had not broken, but it had shifted its emotional center. What remained between them was a space that had not existed before, a space created without argument, without accusation, and without open conflict. Every cautious glance signaled a household quietly recalibrating around a new emotional center. Yet each shortened greeting revealed how far the wife had drifted from the trust she once commanded. And the silence that settled in the hallways confirmed a truth no one dared articulate. The home was changing, even though nothing had been openly challenged. A single mistake from the wife carried more weight than she understood. Inside a Tudor household, already shifting in mood and perception, even a small lapse became an anchor point for servants searching for meaning. Their caution had grown into a habit, and their expectations shaped how they interpreted everything she did. When the wife finally displayed a moment of irritation, short, sharp, and entirely human, the household received it as confirmation of traits they had already begun to associate with her. The error mattered less than the story that followed it. The moment itself was ordinary, a misplaced item, a delay in completing a task, a morning that unfolded with more noise than usual. The wife's patience thinned, and her voice rose just slightly above its usual steady tone. It was not a scene of chaos, nor an outburst meant to wound. It was simply a response to accumulated frustrations. But the servants who witnessed it carried the memory with attention sharpened by weeks of distance. They replayed her raised voice as though it were sharper than it had been, and they discussed it quietly as though it revealed more than it truly did. The other woman did not need to encourage this reaction. The household's mood did the work for her. Servants repeated what they saw with subtle exaggerations that felt natural rather than intentional. A brief flash of irritation became evidence of a temper. A short command sounded like a reprimand. A frustrated gesture turned into proof of instability. These retellings evolved with each exchange, not through malice, but through the lens of suspicion that had already taken root. Servants believed they were describing the moment accurately. In reality, they were interpreting it through the emotional distance that now defined their relationship with the wife. Old memories resurfaced next. Servants who once dismissed past errors now revisited them, fitting them into a narrative they had only recently begun to accept. A previous oversight by the wife, once insignificant, became part of a pattern. A past moment of sternness gained new significance. Even neutral interactions from earlier weeks were reinterpreted as hints of the temper they believed they had witnessed. These memories blended with the present moment until the wife appeared harsher in recollection than she had ever been in actuality. The other woman listened quietly. She never prompted these discussions, yet her calm presence encouraged servants to continue sharing. Their words grew more certain each time they repeated the story. By the time the memory settled into place, it no longer resembled the wife's original action. It had become a symbol, an example used to explain the tension they felt and the wariness with which they now looked at her. Their retellings gained a life beyond the moment itself, shaping the emotional texture of the household. Indirect storytelling strengthened the effect. A servant who had seen the incident shared it with one who had not. Details blurred slightly as the story traveled, then crystallized into something sharper and more definitive than the truth. A tone became harsher. A gesture became more dramatic. A pause became longer. The story grew because each listener added their own expectations, reinforcing the version that aligned with the new household narrative. This was not gossip in its traditional form. It was the natural evolution of perception within a system, already leaning away from the wife. Meanwhile, the wife sensed only fragments of this shift. She felt the servants' stiffness, the hesitation in their steps, the softening of their voices when they responded to her. She recognized that something had changed but struggled to identify the source. She adjusted her behavior, hoping to ease the tension. But every attempt met the same filtered interpretation. Her calmness looked like detachment. Her restraint felt like judgment. Nothing she offered entered the household without passing through the servant's altered perception. The other woman gained influence simply by not reacting. Her steady, quiet presence provided contrast. When servants approached her after witnessing the wife's irritation, she listened without correction. Her silence felt validating. Her calmness felt like protection. Servants gravitated toward her because she offered the emotional stability they believed the wife lacked. Through this contrast, the wife's authority weakened even further, replaced by an impression she never intended to create. Over time, the single moment of irritation became the defining story of her character. Servants referenced it when explaining their caution to each other. They repeated it when discussing the household's mood. They used it to justify why they followed the other woman's unspoken influence more readily than the wife's commands. The moment became larger than itself, shaping how the household understood the dynamics within the home. In a structure built on perception, the smallest error could shift the balance of influence. And in this home, once the story took root, it traveled through corridors and stairwells until it shaped every room the wife entered. Every exaggerated memory strengthened the narrative, forming quietly behind her back. Yet each retold detail carried more weight than the moment that inspired it. When the household embraced this revised portrait of her temperament, the wife stood alone inside a story she no longer recognized. Building the image of someone who protected the servants did not require public gestures or grand declarations. It unfolded through small, deliberate moments placed carefully into the daily rhythm of the Tudor household. The other woman understood that influence took root most firmly when wrapped in quiet acts of consideration. She positioned herself not as a rival to the wife, but as a presence that softened the weight of household discipline. Over time, the servants associated her with ease, safety, and understanding, qualities that reshaped their emotional alignment far more effectively than authority alone. The process began with moments of apparent sympathy. When a servant received a reprimand for a mistake, the other woman allowed herself to be seen nearby. She did not intervene openly. She simply remained present, acknowledging the servant's discomfort with a calm expression. Her stillness conveyed the impression of someone silently taking their side. A lowered gaze, a slow breath, a steady posture. These gestures formed the foundation of a connection rooted not in words, but in shared awareness. Servants read this presence as support, even though she had said nothing. Later, the other woman reinforced this impression through discreet actions. A servant who feared further criticism found that their small error, a misplaced item, an unpolished corner, had already been corrected before the wife discovered it. Another, who believed they had drawn too much attention during the previous evening's tasks, realized that no mention of it reached the wife. These quiet interventions were subtle enough to avoid detection, yet strong enough to create an emotional imprint. The servants began to recognize that someone watched over them, not with scrutiny, but with intention. These protective gestures made the servants feel indebted in a way that tightened their loyalty. The feeling was not transactional, it was emotional. Protection, even in small forms, created a sense of obligation that shaped how the servants moved through the household. They remembered the moments when their mistakes had not been exposed. They recalled the times when their unease had been met with a steady presence. These memories accumulated like layers of quiet reassurance, forming a foundation of gratitude that gradually converted into allegiance. At the same time, the other woman positioned herself within the servant's daily movements without appearing intrusive. She entered the kitchen corridor at moments when tensions were high. She passed through the laundry room when a task had gone wrong. She stood near the stairwell when a servant rushed to conceal an oversight. Her presence offered comfort simply by existing in the right place at the right time. Servants began to look for her unconsciously, associating her with relief and steadiness. The household learned to interpret her proximity as a form of emotional protection. The wife, meanwhile, remained unaware of these subtle dynamics. She carried herself with the same seriousness she always had. Believing that discipline maintained order, she assumed that correcting errors preserved stability. Her approach was consistent. Yet the servants now interpreted her consistency as rigidity. Each reprimand from her created a contrast that strengthened the other woman's influence. The wife did nothing differently, yet she appeared harsher because the servants had someone else to compare her to. This contrast deepened further when the other woman allowed herself to be perceived as shielding the servants from consequences. When she rearranged a task to prevent a mistake from being noticed, she ensured that the servants attributed the change to her thoughtfulness. When she softened the atmosphere in a room just after a reprimand, they understood it as a gesture of care. None of these actions challenged the wife directly, yet each one subtly weakened the emotional authority the wife once held. Servants began confiding in the other woman through their posture and presence rather than words. They lingered slightly longer in her vicinity. They moved with a slow attention when she entered a room, as though setting down a burden they carried everywhere else. Their bodies betrayed a trust they no longer extended to the wife. These small physical cues signaled a shifting emotional center, one that no rule or command from the wife could easily reclaim. As this pattern continued, the servant's perception of responsibility changed. When a mistake happened, they no longer feared the consequences as sharply, even before the other woman intervened. They anticipated her presence as a buffer between themselves and the wife's discipline. This expectation altered their behavior, making them less attentive to the wife's authority and more attuned to the other woman's quiet reassurance. The emotional weight of the household gradually redistributed itself. Over time, the image of the other woman as a protector solidified. Servants associated the wife with order and consequences, while associating the other woman with safety and understanding. This dichotomy shaped their choices, their loyalties, and their instincts. When a servant felt uncertain, they drifted toward the other woman. When tension rose, they sought her steady presence. Influence, once divided, now leaned decisively toward the person who offered comfort rather than discipline. By the time the wife noticed the shift, the emotional foundation of her authority had already weakened. The servants still obeyed her commands, but their silent allegiance belonged elsewhere. They moved with a calmness in the other woman's presence that they no longer displayed around her. They carried out tasks with more care when they believed she might see them. Their sense of belonging shifted subtly toward the influence that had protected them. Every small act of shielding deepened the servant's quiet trust in her. Yet each overlooked mistake strengthened the bond she never had to ask for. And in the unspoken gratitude of the household, her influence grew where the wife's authority once stood alone. Weakening the wife's authority did not require direct defiance. It unfolded through delays so subtle they appeared accidental, through hesitation that seemed like fatigue, and through choices made quietly in the servants' minds long before they acted. The shifting emotional center of the household had already conditioned them to expect more ease from the other woman than from the wife. Their movements reflected this expectation, even when they believed they were still honoring the structure of the home. The first signs appeared in response time. When the wife issued a command, servants paused before obeying. Not long enough to call it resistance, but long enough for the rhythm of the household to change. A task once completed immediately now requires a second reminder. A request that once drew swift movement now resulted in careful, almost reluctant steps. The servants preserved the appearance of obedience, yet their responsiveness grew slower with each passing day. They moved as though her words took longer to reach them, as though the distance created earlier had seeped into their bodies. This hesitation was not coordinated. It developed naturally from the servants' shifting loyalties. Their emotional alignment shaped their instincts. They no longer felt urgency when the wife spoke, because her approval no longer held the same weight. They continued to work, yet their attention drifted toward the person they believed would treat them with understanding rather than scrutiny. Their delay was a reflection of comfort, not rebellion, but the effect on the wife's authority was unmistakable. Tasks assigned by the wife began to fall behind schedule. A room was left unprepared longer than expected. A garment awaited mending, even though the materials sat ready. A chore meant for the early afternoon was completed only at dusk. Each delay appeared minor, but together they signaled a rhythm no longer shaped by the wife's expectations. The other woman did nothing to encourage this shift. She simply existed as the presence the servants gravitated toward emotionally, and their sense of priority reorganized itself around that presence. The servants told themselves they meant no disrespect. They believed they were simply taking more time to ensure their work was done well. Yet the delays grew consistent enough to alter the household's patterns. The wife felt the changes immediately. She noticed that rooms lost their crisp order, that chores required 2 reminders instead of 1, and that servants carried out her requests with a stiffness that suggested reluctance rather than diligence. Her attempts to correct this drift only made her seem more severe in the servants' eyes. Meanwhile, the other woman's needs began to take precedence, without her speaking a word. Servants completed her errands faster, not because she instructed them openly, but because they expected her to respond with the calmness they preferred. When she passed a servant struggling with a task, her simple presence made them work with more care. When she walked through a corridor, they straightened automatically, not out of fear, but out of the desire to meet the expectations they believed she silently held for them. This responsiveness contrasted sharply with the hesitation that met the wife's commands. The shift in priority became clearer during moments of competing demands. If the wife required a task to be completed at the same time, the other woman needed assistance. Servants instinctively leaned toward the other woman. They justified this choice to themselves with practical reasoning. The other task seemed quicker, the route to her side more convenient, the wife's request capable of waiting a moment longer. They convinced themselves the decision was efficient, not emotional, yet the pattern repeated enough that it became impossible to ignore. The household's flow now followed a different center of gravity. The wife, accustomed to precise order, felt the structure slipping away. She sensed that her voice no longer carried the same certainty. Her commands met with quiet hesitation instead of immediate movement. She observed the ease with which servants responded to the other woman's presence and recognized the contrast. Though she could not identify its cause, the shift unsettled her, sharpening the tone she used to regain control. But the servants interpreted this sharpened tone as further evidence of strictness, deepening the cycle already in motion. Over time, her authority hollowed out. It remained present in principle. She still held the legal and social position of mistress of the household, but it lacked the supportive weight of daily obedience. Servants complied with her commands only after accommodating the other woman's silent influence. The household followed the wife's rules, but it followed the other woman's rhythm. This distinction shaped every room, every task, every moment of interaction. Resentment did not drive this realignment. Weariness did. The servants felt more at ease responding to the person who protected them from criticism, who softened their mistakes, and who watched without judgment. Their loyalties shifted not through argument, but through emotional refuge. They moved away from the wife gradually, instinctively, until obedience became an obligation rather than a connection. The wife remained the official authority, yet she no longer shaped the heartbeat of the household. This quiet reordering defined the new balance of influence long before anyone acknowledged it. Servants did not speak of disobedience. They simply behaved in ways that reflected the hierarchy they felt, rather than the one written on paper. And in a Tudor household, feelings could carry as much force as law. Every delayed response stripped a layer from the wife's authority, which she could not reinforce. Yet each quiet preference strengthened the other woman's place within the servant's daily rhythm. Once the household adjusted to this new pattern, the wife faced a structure that no longer moved at her command. Delays inside a Tudor household did not begin with defiance. They began with hesitation so small it seemed like a natural pause in movement. A servant heard the wife's instruction, nodded, and continued the task already in hand for a moment longer. Another moved toward the door after being given a command, but slowed just as they crossed the threshold, as though reconsidering their steps. These moments accumulated until the rhythm of the home shifted into something noticeably slower, something that no longer aligned with the wife's expectations. The wife felt the change before she understood it. She sensed it in the air, the slight drag in the servant's posture, the faint delay before they turned their attention toward her. The household once responded to her voice with immediate momentum. Now that momentum faltered. Tasks, she considered simple, required repeated reminders. Assignments once completed smoothly now reached her with small imperfections she was not accustomed to seeing. The pattern unsettled her, and she watched closely for an explanation that never presented itself clearly. What she perceived as negligence, the servants experienced as caution. Their growing discomfort around her shaped how quickly they reacted. Each movement carried a layer of restraint, as though they weighed the consequences of action more heavily than before. Their minds sought safety, and safety no longer aligned with urgency. A pause felt easier than quick obedience. A slow step felt less risky than a hurried one. The household took on the measured pace of people, unsure of how their presence was received. The other woman's influence deepened this shift without requiring a single instruction. Servants moved more fluidly around her, drawn to the steadiness of her presence. When she crossed a room, they adjusted their tasks instinctively. When she appeared near a chore undone, they quickened their work. Their responsiveness to her highlighted the contrast with their hesitation around the wife. The difference defined the new emotional landscape of the home, sharpening the wife's sense of slipping control even further. As the delays grew more consistent, they formed a pattern that the wife could not ignore. She observed servants pausing before lifting trays, standing slightly too long in doorways, or adjusting linens with a deliberateness that stretched the moment beyond what was necessary. These were not acts of open disobedience. They were subtle, almost imperceptible signs of a household recalibrating itself. The wife sensed the shift in her bones rather than in any particular gesture, and this intangible quality made the change harder to confront. Her attempts to restore order often reinforced the distance. When she repeated a command with more emphasis, the servants stiffened. When she clarified an instruction, their movements grew even more careful. Her voice, meant to guide them back into alignment, instead deepened the caution that slowed them. The household responded to her tone rather than her intention, interpreting purposefulness as pressure. The more she tried to correct the delays, the more the rhythm of the home resisted her efforts. Small acts carried large implications. A tray delivered minutes late interrupted the flow of a meal. A garment prepared slowly forced her to wait longer than expected. A hallway left unattended for a short moment caused her to encounter disorder she rarely witnessed. Each delay reminded her of a structure slipping out of her grasp, of a home that no longer moved in harmony with her expectations. These reminders settled into her awareness quietly but heavily. The servants felt the shift differently. To them, the delays signaled a protective restraint. Acting quickly for the wife risked tension. Acting quickly for the other woman offered reassurance. Their instincts followed the path of least discomfort, and their bodies moved accordingly. Delay became a language, one that communicated hesitation without accusation, distance without open rebellion. Through this language, the balance of influence shifted one small gesture at a time. The wife found herself surrounded by a silence that grew sharper each day. She felt isolated, not because the servants refused her commands, but because their compliance lacked the connection that once made the household feel unified. She issued instructions, but the energy that once drove the home into motion faltered. Her authority remained intact in form, yet weakened in practice. By the time she understood the depth of the shift, the delays had become the new normal. The household no longer followed her pace. It followed a slower, quieter rhythm shaped by caution, comfort, and emotional allegiance. Her commands passed through the home like distant echoes, reaching ears that heard them but no longer carried them forward with immediacy. Every slowed movement revealed a resistance too subtle to name, yet each delayed task marked another thread slipping from her grasp. As hesitation became the household's unspoken rhythm, the wife stood at the center of a home that no longer responded to her instinctively. A parallel network of information did not appear suddenly. It emerged through repeated patterns. Small moments when servants chose to share details with the other woman before fulfilling their duties to the wife. These choices felt natural to them. Their emotional alignment had shifted, and information followed the same path as their loyalty. In a Tudor household, where knowledge shaped every decision, the flow of information determined who held influence. The other woman understood this, even if she never stated it aloud. The shift began with simple observations. A servant passing through a corridor noticed the husband returning earlier than expected. Instead of informing the wife, whose reaction they feared might carry tension, they mentioned it quietly to the other woman, whose expression remained calm and steady. This exchange felt harmless, but it created the first thread of a communication pattern that would soon define the household. Information flowed toward the person who offered the least resistance, the most stability, and the quietest presence. Servants continued to adjust their habits without realizing the significance. They entered the other woman's proximity more frequently with details about the household's schedule, the husband's movements, or the mood of the rooms they passed through. Each piece of information seemed small, too insignificant to alter the larger dynamics of the home. Yet together, they formed a map of the household that the other woman understood more clearly than the wife. She received these details not because she demanded them, but because the servants trusted her with the emotional weight of their observations. Information about the husband's temperament shifted first. A servant noticed his frustration after a failed business matter and shared it with the other woman before anyone else heard. Another observed his unusually quiet demeanor during supper and carried the impression to her as well. These early warnings allowed her to adjust her behavior, positioning herself as someone attuned to the household's tone. She entered rooms at the right moments, avoided the ones charged with tension, and maintained a presence that never collided with the husband's shifting moods. Servants interpreted this as sensitivity, strengthening their desire to keep her informed. Meanwhile, the wife remained unaware of these early signals. She encountered the husband's frustrations without preparation. She walked into rooms without the context the servants now shared elsewhere. This difference in information deepened the emotional distance already forming between her and the servants. The household no longer operated around her awareness. It moved around the quiet network, forming beyond her reach. The parallel flow of information grew stronger as servants realized the other woman's awareness helped maintain stability. When the home felt unsettled, she adjusted her movements to soften the atmosphere. When tensions rose, she guided her presence to avoid inflaming them. Servants noticed these careful adjustments and believed she understood them more deeply than the wife did. Their instinct to approach her first became a routine. Gradually, the wife became the last person to learn the details shaping the home. She discovered the husband's mood only after servants had already adjusted their posture. She learned of schedule changes only after the other woman had positioned herself accordingly. She found herself reacting to events rather than anticipating them. Each delayed piece of information made her appear less connected to the pulse of the household, widening the gap between her authority and her effectiveness. This isolation was not intentional sabotage. It was the natural result of servants choosing comfort over duty. They feared the wife's potential displeasure more than the other woman's gentle presence. Sharing information with her felt easier, softer, and less emotionally fraught. By the time they considered informing the wife, the usefulness of the information had already diminished. The wife moved through the home as though stepping onto a stage moments after the scene had already been set. The other woman never appeared to interfere. She accepted information quietly, allowing the servant's trust to deepen on its own. Her calmness created the impression that she understood the household better than its rightful mistress. And in many ways, she did. She possessed context that the wife lacked. She adjusted her behavior according to knowledge shared only with her. This context shaped her influence, giving her a presence that felt attuned to the household's needs. By contrast, the wife's behavior seemed increasingly out of step. She entered rooms at the wrong moments, spoke without the context others assumed she had, and reacted to situations that everyone else had already braced themselves for. These misalignments reinforced the servant's belief that she was no longer the emotional anchor of the home. The network of information defined the real center of influence, and that center had shifted entirely. In time, the household developed two layers of understanding, the one the wife believed she controlled, and the one the servants quietly shared with the other woman. The distance between these layers widened until the wife realized she was navigating her own home without the clarity she once possessed. Every redirected detail strengthened the network forming beneath her awareness. Yet each withheld observation pushed her further from the rhythm of the home. Then, the alternate flow of information grew into the servant's quiet habit, leaving the wife the last to know what shaped her own household. Controlling the emotional atmosphere of a Tudor household required no raised voices and no explicit instructions. It depended on timing, presence, and the subtle shaping of how rooms felt before the wife ever stepped inside them. The other woman understood that servants responded not only to authority, but to mood, and she positioned herself within the home so that the emotional temperature aligned with her influence rather than the wife's. Long before the wife appeared in a corridor or entered a chamber, The servants had already absorbed a tone that guided their reactions. The shift began with simple adjustments. Moments before the wife arrived, servants softened their expressions, lowered their voices, and moved more carefully, creating an atmosphere that felt tense rather than neutral. This tension affected how the wife perceived the household and how the household perceived her in return. She entered rooms already preloaded with unease, finding her presence reflected in the servant's stiffness rather than in a natural rhythm. The other woman never orchestrated these moments openly. She merely allowed her calm, steady presence to settle first, shaping the room into something the wife always seemed to disrupt rather than harmonize with. Servants began anticipating her influence. They prepared the emotional setting in ways that favored her even without realizing it. A servant adjusted the pace of their work to appear flustered when the wife approached, though they had been relaxed moments earlier. Another whispered a short explanation to a peer that framed the wife's impending entrance as something demanding caution. These behaviors were not rooted in disloyalty. They reflected the mood they had learned to associate with her presence. Their subtle cues shifted the emotional framing of every room she entered. When the wife reacted to the tension by straightening her posture, by sharpening her focus, or by correcting a task, the servants interpreted her response as further proof of strictness. The other woman seldom needed to intervene. Instead, she offered the servants a different emotional center, one shaped by composure, attentiveness, and steadiness. Her presence alone could smooth their movements. Her silence felt lighter than the wife's silence. Her glances appeared thoughtful, whereas the wife's seemed scrutinizing. These contrasts deepened naturally through daily repetition. The servants also learned to prepare explanations that softened the other woman's role and sharpened the wife's. If a task was incomplete, they offered reasons that redirected responsibility away from the other woman and towards circumstances that made the wife's eventual reaction seem unnecessary or exaggerated. These explanations, spoken briefly and quietly, shaped the emotional flow of information. They framed small disruptions as misunderstandings rather than mistakes. By the time the wife learned of them, her frustration felt out of step with what the servants had already processed emotionally. This dynamic reduced the impact of the wife's reactions. When she expressed displeasure, the servants received it through the filter of the emotional groundwork already established. Her concerns felt heavier than they were meant to be. Her corrections seemed harsher. Her attempts to restore order sounded sharper. The servants did not resist her authority, but they interpreted her responses through a lens that diminished their legitimacy. Within this framework, her reactions carried less weight than the atmosphere the other woman had shaped before she even spoke. Over time, the household learned to adjust itself, not to avoid mistakes, but to manage the wife's presence. Rooms were quiet before she arrived. Tasks were arranged in ways that made her corrections appear unnecessary. Explanations were prepared to diffuse her influence. These adjustments created a subtle emotional barrier between her and the servants. She encountered a home that responded to her with controlled restraint rather than genuine engagement, and the distance grew with each passing day. The other woman's influence expanded quietly within this system. She did not direct the servants. She simply existed as the emotional alternative they preferred. When she walked into a room, the atmosphere softened instead of tightening. When she moved through a corridor, the servants shifted naturally into smoother rhythms. Her presence became a reference point, and the household shaped itself around her steadiness rather than the wife's authority. The wife, sensing the emotional dissonance, attempted to manage the tension. She adjusted her tone, moderated her pace, and tried to enter rooms with a gentler posture. But these efforts were interpreted as calculated rather than natural. The emotional spaces had already been shaped before she arrived, and her attempts to influence them sounded against the grain. Her presence always felt like an interruption rather than a continuation of the household's flow. By the time the pattern solidified, the emotional architecture of the home belonged to the other woman. Servants responded to her presence instinctively. shaped their mood around her calmness, and approached their tasks with the ease they associated with her guidance. The wife stood outside this emotional network, reacting to a tone she could not control and facing a distance she could not identify. Every prepared atmosphere softened the servants toward one presence and stiffened them toward another. Yet each quiet explanation weakened the force of the wife's reactions. And gradually, the emotional balance of the home shifted toward the person who shaped the room before the wife ever entered it. A Tudor household carried its stories through the hands and footsteps of servants long before those stories reached the people they concerned. By the time the husband began listening to the servants' descriptions of daily events, the narrative had already been shaped, softened, or sharpened in ways that aligned with the quiet loyalties forming beneath the surface. What he heard was never the raw moment, but a version filtered through shifting emotions, silent biases, and the growing influence of the other woman who now held the servants' trust. The servants did not intend manipulation. Their retellings reflected the impressions they had absorbed. The tension around the wife, the comfort around the other woman, the altered emotional rhythm of the household. When the husband asked about a disturbance or attempted to understand the wife's mood, they offered explanations shaped by what felt true to them. A hesitation in the wife's voice became a sign of coldness. A moment of frustration became a pattern. Their descriptions aligned naturally with the emotional story taking hold in their daily lives. Once these impressions reached the husband, they carried a weight far greater than the servants realized. He listened to them as observers of the home, believing their proximity made them reliable. Yet their proximity also made them vulnerable to influence. Their experiences had been shaped long before he sought their perspective. Each detail they shared reinforced the narrative that the wife was losing touch with the household and that her emotional presence no longer supported stability. What he heard sounded reasonable, but reason had already been bent by the atmosphere created around him. The husband's emotions responded accordingly. When he learned that his wife appeared tense earlier in the day, he approached her with caution. When he heard she had spoken sharply, he met her with restrained judgment. His reactions were shaped less by direct interaction and more by what the servants had prepared him to expect. The emotional distance he felt grew not from the wife herself, but from the filter through which her actions had been described. He entered conversations with assumptions already in place, shifting the balance of the relationship before a single word passed between them. Meanwhile, the other woman positioned herself quietly within these shifting dynamics. She never corrected the servants, never encouraged their retellings, and never presented herself as a source of information. Her silence allowed the narrative to deepen on its own. When the husband looked in her direction during moments of uncertainty, her calmness provided a contrast to the wife's perceived tension. He interpreted this contrast as meaning rather than coincidence. In his mind, stability and understanding seemed to radiate from her without effort. The servants noticed this and adjusted their retellings even further. They softened their descriptions of the other woman's involvement, allowing her to appear as a passive, gentle presence. They emphasized the wife's strictness without exaggeration, simply recalling the impression her presence now created. Their words settled into the husband's thoughts with quiet authority. Over time, he believed he was observing the household clearly, even though he was absorbing only its curated version. The wife sensed a shift long before she understood its cause. She found the husband watching her with a new distance, responding to her tone with misplaced caution, and interpreting her movements through a lens she did not recognize. She felt misunderstood in her own home, judged not by her actions, but by the interpretations of those who had already turned away from her emotionally. Her attempts to communicate clearly met confusion rather than understanding. Conversations that once flowed naturally now felt layered with invisible resistance. This misunderstanding widened the space between them. Each time the husband responded with assumptions shaped by servant retellings, the wife felt the gap deepen. She adjusted her behavior to counter the impressions she sensed but could not articulate. Yet each adjustment made her appear even more guarded. reinforcing the narrative that she was difficult or distant. The more she tried to correct the emotional current, the more the household resisted her efforts. The servants' influence extended further than they ever intended. Their words guided the husband's perception. Their tone shaped his judgments. And their quiet preferences determined whom he trusted instinctively. Without confrontation, they shifted the household's balance. The wife remained central in position, yet peripheral in influence. Her authority weakened, not through action, but through the interpretation of her actions. By the time the husband recognized the household's emotional divide, the servant's narrative had already settled firmly in his mind. He viewed the wife through a framework built by others. One he believed came from observation rather than influence. Her place within the home changed accordingly, and the authority she once held within the marriage grew thinner each day. Every shaped retelling guided his understanding more than the reality he witnessed. Yet each softened description of another presence redirected his emotional trust. And gradually, the wife's voice faded beneath a story she had no part in crafting. Isolation inside a Tudor household rarely announced itself with dramatic gestures or open defiance. It arrived quietly, settling into routines, behaviors, and glances that seemed harmless on their own, but carried weight when woven together. The wife remained at the center of the home in principle. Yet the emotional structure around her shifted until she stood alone without understanding when the ground beneath her had changed. No one rejected her authority openly. Instead, the household began moving in patterns that left her without support. Connection, or ease. The first signs appeared in the subtle ways servants arranged themselves. They still carried out her commands, but they no longer lingered in her presence. Conversations ended the moment she entered a room. Movements grew more controlled, more cautious, as if the servants were shielding themselves from a reaction they feared but had never actually experienced. They stood straighter, breathed quieter, and completed tasks with an efficiency that lacked the natural rhythm once present. She sensed something missing, something that used to soften the atmosphere but had vanished without explanation. As the emotional distance grew, the servants' loyalties shifted in ways that did not look like disobedience. They responded to her instructions, but their attention drifted elsewhere. Their posture showed obedience, yet their instincts aligned with the other woman. When uncertainty arose, they looked not to the wife for guidance, but toward the calmer presence who seemed to understand their pace, their mistakes, and their fears. The wife remained the official authority, but authority alone no longer shaped the household's behavior. Moments that once carried warmth became transactional. A servant handed her an item with precise movements, but without the ease that had characterized earlier interactions. Another stepped aside to make room for her, but avoided meeting her eyes. These gestures signaled nothing on their own. Yet together, they formed a quiet pattern of withdrawal. The wife felt the shift in her body before she understood it in her thoughts. She entered rooms prepared for the same harmony she once knew, only to encounter an atmosphere that tightened around her movements. The husband's behavior reflected this change as well. Influenced by the servants' filtered narratives, he approached her with caution that felt unfamiliar. He watched her reactions as though expecting tension, even when she offered none. His presence no longer anchored her position within the home. His subtle withdrawal mirrored the unspoken distance the servants had already formed. The home, once a structure that reinforced her place, now felt like a series of disconnected spaces she struggled to navigate. The other woman did not challenge her directly. She stood in the household with steady composure, offering comfort through presence rather than action. Servants gravitated toward her naturally, interpreting her calmness as understanding. She became the emotional reference point of the home, while the wife became the figure people approached with caution. This shift happened quietly, shaped by the servant's perception rather than by the other woman's intention. Her influence deepened simply because she moved through the home without friction. The wife's isolation grew more visible in daily routines. She sat at her place in the dining room, while servants moved around her with mechanical precision. She walked through corridors that once echoed with a familiar rhythm, but now felt cold. She issued commands that were carried out, but never with the natural fluidity they once held. Her presence no longer shaped the emotional tone of the home. Instead, it triggered a tightening of posture and a measured restraint. She noticed the absence of small gestures she once took for granted. No servant anticipated her needs before she spoke. No one adjusted the atmosphere of a room to ease her day. Tasks were completed, but the care behind them had thinned. The subtle emotional support that defined a functioning household had shifted away from her entirely. She felt the weight of this absence each time she stepped into a room and sensed the invisible separation binding the walls together. The isolation was not violent, not loud, not confrontational. It was procedural, almost systematic. Each servant's quiet shift contributed to a larger pattern. Each hesitation, each lowered gaze, each moment of stiffened movement reinforced the emotional boundary forming around her. She was not excluded by command. She was excluded by atmosphere. The home that once reflected her presence now reflected only her position, leaving her authority hollow. By the time she realized the full extent of the shift, the isolation had already solidified. She could move through every room and still feel unseen. She could speak and still feel unheard. She could command and still feel unsupported. The transformation had taken place without a single act of rebellion. It unfolded through silence, repetition, and the quiet loyalty that had drifted away from her. Every measured gesture revealed a distance no one dared acknowledge. Yet each restrained interaction deepened her solitude inside the home she once guided with ease. Finally, the quiet structure of daily life held her apart, shaping an isolation she could neither challenge nor escape. A Tudor household could adjust itself quietly, forming new patterns without announcing when the shift began. The wife did not need to be pushed aside for her absence to take shape. The home adapted around her with a kind of slow, steady rearrangement. The spaces she once occupied remained the same, yet the rhythms inside them changed until her presence no longer shaped the household's daily life. What had once been centered around her became functional without her, then increasingly indifferent to whether she appeared at all. The reduction of her role did not occur through defiance. It unfolded through repetition. Servants who once waited for her approval started completing tasks based on routine rather than direction. They did not refuse her authority. They simply stopped depending on it. When a decision needed to be made and she was not nearby, they handled it themselves or looked toward the other woman, who stood closer, both physically and emotionally. Each small adjustment made her absence feel less disruptive. Over time, the wife found fewer responsibilities waiting for her. Tasks she once supervised had already been completed before she entered the room. Preparations she used to oversee were now handled without consultation. The servants worked smoothly, but their efficiency left her without a point of entry. She moved through the home as the day unfolded naturally around her, discovering that the household functioned without her input. This change was not hostile. It was simply settled, as though the home had learned to operate along a different axis. The shift became even more visible when the servants began seeking guidance from the other woman. They approached her quietly, asking for directions on minor duties that they once confirmed with the wife. She did not claim this authority. She accepted their questions with a steady calmness that made the interactions look necessary rather than intentional. Soon, her presence became the dependable reference point for the household's rhythm. While the wife's presence became a formality, a respected figure who no longer shaped decisions, the wife noticed these patterns through the stillness around her. Her instructions were carried out, but they no longer guided the broader structure of the day. Tasks she assigned were treated as separate from the home's regular flow, completed with precision but without influence. The household had begun to rely on habits formed in her absence, and those habits held their shape even when she stood in the room. This normalization emerged in every part of the home. In the kitchen, routines ran smoothly before she arrived. In the corridors, servants adjusted their movements according to rhythms she had not set. In shared spaces, decisions about lighting, arrangement, and timing appeared to happen without her involvement. These details did not contradict her authority, but they diluted it. Her presence no longer interrupted anything because nothing depended on it. As these new patterns strengthened, the home responded to her absence with ease. When she stayed longer in her private rooms, the servants did not check on her needs. When she left a task unaddressed, someone else completed it without waiting. What once would have been considered neglect or uncertainty now feels normal. The home had grown accustomed to functioning without her direction. Her absence no longer created a gap. It simply maintained the flow already in place. The other woman's influence continued to grow quietly in parallel. Her guidance shaped small choices, the order of tasks, the timing of meals, the arrangement of rooms. These decisions were subtle, but together they reshaped daily life. The servants trusted her steadiness, her predictability, her calm demeanor. Without ever claiming control, she became the center of their practical world, the person they turned to when clarity was needed. The wife felt the weight of this shift as a gradual loss rather than a single moment. She observed the home adjusting to itself without her. He saw the servants carrying out routines she no longer understood fully, and sensed the quiet realignment of loyalty that left her outside the emotional structure of the household. She remained a significant figure in title, but the daily life beneath those titles moved along pathways that no longer crossed through her. The normalization of her absence was not a rejection. It was a quiet reorganization of the household's instincts. The wife's presence no longer shaped the rhythm of the day. Her absence no longer disrupted it. The home had learned another pattern, one that placed her at the edge of its movements, watching as routines unfolded without her influence. Gradually, the household adjusted to her absence without hesitation. Soon, the servants sought guidance elsewhere, letting new habits settle into place. Eventually, her role diminished not by conflict, but by routines that no longer waited for her. Power inside a Tudor household often revealed itself not through declarations, but through subtle redirections of attention. Even when the legal wife held every formal right, she discovered that authority embossed on paper could not command the emotional currents moving quietly beneath the surface. Her position remained intact by law, yet influence, shaped through daily interactions and unspoken loyalty, began to shift away from her. The home still acknowledged her title, but its rhythm no longer responded to her presence with the same instinctive obedience it once held. The wife's legitimacy had been secured through marriage, lineage, and tradition. Her role was publicly recognized and socially protected. She represented continuity, stability, and proper order. Every room in the house reflected her status, from the servants' greetings to the structured rituals of the day. Yet, legitimacy created the expectation of authority, not the assurance of it. The routines she oversaw began functioning independently of her guidance, and the loyalty she relied upon thinned into a formality rather than a genuine bond. In contrast, the other woman moved through the household without any of the burdens that accompanied rank. She held no official place, no claim recognized by society, and no protection under the law. Yet these absences allowed her to exist in the home with a softer presence. Servants approached her not out of duty but out of ease. They recognized her quiet consistency, her gentle responses, and her patience with their mistakes. Over time, these qualities formed a foundation of trust, something the wife, weighed down by responsibility and expectation, struggled to offer with the same natural steadiness. This trust became the quiet force that redirected the household. Servants did not consciously abandon the wife. They simply gravitated toward the person who felt more emotionally accessible. When uncertainty arose, They looked instinctively toward the other woman. When tension thickened in the corridors, her presence calmed it. When decisions needed to be made quickly, her sense of composure guided them. None of these moments appeared significant on their own. Together, they formed an undercurrent strong enough to shift daily life. For the wife, the shift revealed itself through changed reactions. Her commands were followed, but not with the same attentiveness. Her requests were respected, but not relied upon. The servants adjusted their tasks around the other woman's movements, anticipating her preferences more readily than the wife's. She noticed that her authority still existed, yet it no longer shaped the household's emotional center. Her influence remained visible only on the surface, while the deeper current flowed elsewhere. Meanwhile, the husband responded to the atmosphere created around him, even without deliberate intention. He sensed where the household's calmness settled. The other woman's presence offered steadiness at moments when the wife's strained silence felt heavy. Servant retellings shaped his perception, guiding him toward a narrative that favored the emotional balance he found near the other woman. His responses reinforced the shift already taking place beneath the routines of daily life. The transformation was not sudden. It grew through repetition. Each time a servant sought the other woman's guidance instead of the wife's, a small piece of influence transferred. Each time, the household followed emotions rather than hierarchy. The balance tilted further. Eventually, the wife's authority remained untouched in structure, but weakened in practice. Her title held weight, but her voice no longer directed the internal life of the home. The other woman never needed to claim power. Influence formed around her through proximity, steadiness, and quiet reliability. Servants trusted her because they felt seen by her. They shaped their routines around her because she offered emotional grounding. This trust created a network of instincts that functioned more effectively than the wife's formal authority. Influence became the true center of the home, the force that guided actions, moods, and alliances. For the wife, the realization came gradually. She witnessed routines shifting without her involvement. She felt the servants turning not against her, but away from her. She noticed that the household's emotional rhythm matched the other woman's presence rather than her own. Authority remained attached to her identity, yet power, real, functioning, everyday power, had already slipped from her hands into someone else's without confrontation or intent. This was the nature of influence inside a Tudor household. It gathered not through rank but through alignment. It shaped itself not around titles but around trust. It moved silently, was reinforced by daily habits, and eventually outweighed every legal claim. Every formal right she possessed remained untouched, still visible in the structure of the home. Each quiet loyalty, however, settled beneath the surface where real influence lived. Ultimately, it was not her status, but the servant's trust that determined who guided the household. The quiet victory inside a Tudor household never began with the husband, nor did it depend on open confrontation. It took shape in the spaces where routine settled, where loyalties shifted, and where unnoticed preferences guided the movements of those who kept the home alive. Once the servants changed their alignment, the balance of power followed naturally. Their choices, though small and rarely spoken, determined whose presence carried weight, noise, whose voice shaped the day, and whose absence felt insignificant. By the time anyone realized what had happened, the struggle for influence had already reached its conclusion. The servants had always been the foundation of the household's stability. They cleaned its rooms, maintained its order, prepared its meals, and managed its rhythms. They observed private moments with steady silence and carried the emotional memory of the home in their actions. When they turned toward the other woman, even quietly, the shift redefined the structure of daily life. Their preference shaped the atmosphere around every corridor, task, and interaction. No single act signaled a betrayal. Rather, the accumulation of instinctive choices formed a new alignment that favored her presence over the wife's authority. Once this alignment took root, the wife found herself moving through a home that no longer responded to her in the ways she had once taken for granted. Tasks continued. Routines held, yet everything felt subtly out of reach. Support that used to appear before she asked, now arrived with a delay. Attention that once surrounded her with familiarity now drifted toward someone else. She remained the legal center of the house, but her influence weakened as the servant's loyalty shifted. Her title gave her structure, but structure could not hold together what emotional trust had already abandoned. The other woman never needed to declare her position. Influence settled around her naturally, shaped by the steady way she moved through the rooms and the quiet ease she offered the servants. She became the person they approached when uncertainty arose, the emotional anchor they relied on when tension grew. Her presence softened the atmosphere in ways the wife's strained silence could not. She did not claim power, she simply received it through the daily instincts of those who began to trust her more. By the time the husband sensed the change, the household's internal alignment had already shifted beyond reversal. The servants' retellings, shaped by subtle preference and unconscious bias, guided his perception more than his direct observations could. Their tone, their emphasis, and their quiet pauses framed the wife's behavior through a lens she could not control. As he absorbed these impressions, he found himself responding to the emotional stability surrounding the other woman, rather than the distance forming around his wife. His reactions reinforced the shift that had already taken hold in the household. The wife, standing within the home she was meant to command, felt the weight of isolation deepen. She sensed it in the servants' careful movements, in their lowered gazes, in their instinctive turn towards someone else when decisions needed to be made. She felt it in her husband's quiet hesitation, in his softened responses, in the unspoken judgment, shaped not by her actions, but by the narrative built around her. Influence slipped away from her, not through defiance, but through gradual adjustments she did not see forming. At this point, the battle, if it could be called one, was nearly over. There was no confrontation, no argument, no dramatic breaking point. The shift happened through silence, through repetition, through the emotional drift of those who formed the household's core. When the servants chose a side, the home followed. When the home followed, the husband adjusted. And when the husband adjusted, the wife found herself standing on hollowed ground. She had not lost command in the traditional sense. Her authority remained intact, her status unchallenged. But authority without loyalty lacked force. Status without influence lacked substance. The home, shaped by daily rhythms and quiet instincts, now moved in response to someone else. The wife's voice still held official weight, yet the emotional structure of the household had already reorganized itself beyond her reach. In Tudor households, power often shifted not through rebellion, but through the redirection of attention. Servants controlled the flow of information, the interpretation of events, and the emotional atmosphere surrounding every relationship. Once they turned away from the wife, she no longer stood on solid ground. Her foundation eroded, not from direct challenge, but from the absence of genuine support. The household did not attack her, it simply continued without her. The other woman, surrounded by unspoken loyalty, held a type of power that did not need validation. Influence shaped itself quietly around her. Respect formed through familiarity rather than obligation. She became the unrecognized center of the home's emotional life. The wife, still the legal figurehead, remained unaware of the depth of this transformation until the effects had already settled into place. The outcome required no open conflict. The shift unfolded in the hallways, in the kitchens, in the small rooms where servants exchanged glances and shaped meaning. It unfolded in the husband's subtle changes in perception, in the way he met the wife with caution and the other woman with steadiness. It unfolded in the routines that no longer waited for the wife's direction. By the time the household reached this final stage, the transition was complete. When the servants chose their allegiance, the struggle ended. When the wife lost the foundation beneath her, her authority became an outline rather than a force. When influence changed direction, power changed hands. Without a single public conflict, the household did not need to declare its shift. It lived it. And in this quiet transformation, the true victory was clear. The person who shaped the home's emotional center claimed power long before anyone noticed it had moved. Thank you for staying with the story until its final breath. May your night settle slowly. May your thoughts rest easily. And may you drift into sleep with the calm that follows understanding. Good night.